Alone in his creaky house, Harold sat hunched over his laptop, the glow of a strange YouTube channel reflecting in his watery eyes. How to Reconnect with Lost Loved Ones, read the title. The video, claiming an ancient ritual, could bring his estranged children back to him. Desperation clawed at his heart as he lit candles and muttered incantations. The air thickened, shadows twisted, and suddenly the room plunged into icy silence. A guttural voice broke the void. "You called for me?" Harold sat at his kitchen table, the dim light casting sharp shadows across the cluttered surface. Bills, old photos, and a cold dinner plate surrounded him. The clock ticked relentlessly, counting down the seconds of his isolation. Tonight, like every night for the last year, Harold sat in silence, wondering where it all went wrong. His children, Emily and Patrick, had once filled the house with laughter. He could still hear echoes of their voices, Emily's high-pitched giggle as Patrick chased her around the yard. But those memories were from another life. Years of misunderstandings, unspoken grievances, and bitter arguments had driven them apart. 5 years had passed since he last heard their voices. Not a single letter, not even a text. The silence was unbearable, gnawing at his soul until the ache felt like part of him. He stared at his laptop, the glow of the screen the only source of light in the room. Late-night searches for meaning had led YouTube to suggest an odd video. Reconnect with your loved ones. A ritual that works. The thumbnail showed flickering candles and a shadowy figure. Normally, Harold would have dismissed such nonsense, but tonight, desperation made him click play. A deep, distorted voice spoke over eerie images of ancient symbols and flickering flames. "They are closer than you think," it intoned. "With the right steps, you can bring them back into your life." The instructions were oddly specific. Gather 3 candles, a mirror, and a personal item belonging to the one you wished to contact. Perform the ritual precisely at midnight. Follow the steps, the voice warned, or risk unintended consequences. Harold wasn't one to believe in rituals or magic, but what if it worked? Even if it was temporary, even if it was just a trick of the mind, he was willing to try. Anything was better than this void, this relentless loneliness that seemed to stretch endlessly before him. He rummaged through his drawers. He didn't have much left of his children's belongings, but he did find a favorite photo. Emily and Patrick in Halloween costumes, both grinning from ear to ear. Emily wore a fairy costume, her tiny wings slightly crooked, while Patrick, older by 2 years, posed proudly as a pirate. Harold's hands trembled as he set the photo on the table. The other items were easy to find. He pulled 3 half-burned candles from a drawer, leftovers from a long-forgotten power outage. The mirror was an old, chipped piece from the bathroom. By the time he gathered everything and set them in the living room, the clock read 11:45 p.m. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier as the minutes ticked by. Harold arranged the candles in a triangle on the floor, the mirror in the center, and the photograph at its base. The dim light of the flames cast strange, flickering shadows on the walls. Harold sat cross-legged before the setup, clutching a piece of paper where he'd scribbled the incantation. He felt foolish, but desperation outweighed his doubt. The clock struck midnight. Taking a deep breath, Harold began reciting the words. They felt foreign on his tongue, like a language he wasn't meant to speak. As he spoke, the candle's flames grew taller, almost unnaturally so. The room turned colder, a chill crawling down his spine. Shadows danced wildly around him, twisting into shapes he couldn't quite identify. His heart pounded in his chest as he finished the final word. For a moment, nothing happened. Harold exhaled, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. Of course it was nonsense. What had he expected? That his children would appear out of thin air, smiling and apologizing for all the years they'd been apart? He reached for the photo to put it away. And then the room shifted. The air grew impossibly cold and the candles flickered violently before extinguishing altogether. Harold froze, his breath visible in the icy air, A faint sound, like whispering, echoed through the room. It came from the mirror. His eyes darted toward it, and he saw something that made his blood run cold. The reflection was wrong. The mirror showed the room, but the shadows were darker, deeper, stretching in unnatural ways. And there, in the center of the mirror, was a figure. It was barely more than a silhouette, but its glowing eyes burned into Harold's soul. "You called," it said, its voice low and guttural. Harold scrambled back, his heart hammering. Who are you?" The figure tilted its head as if amused. "I am what you summoned. You wanted to reconnect with loved ones, did you not?" "Yes," Harold whispered. I just wanted to see my children." The figure stepped closer to the mirror's surface. Its form was grotesque, its limbs too long, its face a mockery of human features. "Ah," it said, voice dripping with malice. "Family. Such a fragile thing. Tell me, Harold, how far are you willing to go to bring them back?" "What do you mean?" Harold stammered. The figure grinned, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. "Every gift has a price," it said. "The question is, are you prepared to pay it?" Harold's breath quickened as the figure in the mirror waited for his answer. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, replaced by an oppressive weight pressing on his chest. He didn't know how to respond. What did it mean by price? Was this just a hallucination born of desperation? "Speak, Harold," the figure urged, its voice a low growl. The glow of its eyes pinned him in place. "You sought something you could not find. I can help you, but you must make the choice. Do you wish to see them again?" "Yes," Harold croaked. "I want my children back. I'll do whatever it takes." The figure's grin widened, its sharp teeth gleaming like blades. "Good," it said, its voice dripping with satisfaction. "We shall begin. There are 3 tasks you must complete. Each will test your resolve. Succeed, and you shall have what you desire." Harold hesitated. What kind of tasks?" "All in due time," the figure replied. "For now, prepare. The first task will be given at dawn. Until then, rest. You will need your strength." The mirror darkened, the glowing eyes disappearing. The candles reignited on their own, their flames steady and calm as if nothing had happened. Harold sat frozen, his mind racing. What had he agreed to? The night passed in restless sleep. Harold kept replaying the events, wondering if it had all been a dream. But when dawn broke, the answer became clear. The mirror began to shimmer, the glass rippling like water. Harold approached it cautiously, his heart hammering. "Harold," the voice called, softer now but no less commanding. The figure reappeared, its limbs unnaturally long, its fingers tapering to sharp points. Its presence was no less terrifying. "Your first task," it said, "is simple. You must retrieve something that does not belong to you. Something sacred, cherished. A token of faith." Harold frowned. "What does that mean?" "You will take an object from a place of worship, a symbol of devotion. Bring it to me by midnight and we will proceed." Harold's stomach churned. "You want me to steal? From a church?" "You asked for my help," the figure said, its tone colder. "Fulfill the task or abandon your wish. The choice is yours." The mirror returned to normal, leaving Harold staring at his reflection. He gripped the frame, his knuckles white. He had never stolen anything, let alone from a church. But the thought of seeing Emily and Patrick again, of hearing their voices, was too much to resist. He couldn't back out now. That evening, Harold found himself outside St. Mary's Chapel, a small church on the edge of town. The building was quiet, its stained glass windows glowing faintly in the fading sunlight. He lingered on the steps, his heart pounding. This was wrong, but the figure's words echoed in his mind. Fulfill the task, or abandon your wish. Taking a deep breath, Harold pushed open the heavy wooden doors. The chapel was empty, its pews bathed in the golden light of the setting sun. The air was thick with the scent of incense and aged wood. Harold's footsteps echoed as he walked down the aisle, his eyes scanning for something that might satisfy the figure's demand. At the front of the chapel stood a small altar adorned with candles and a silver cross. Harold hesitated, his hands trembling. The cross gleamed in the dim light, its intricate design catching his eye. It was beautiful, undoubtedly valuable. He reached out, his fingers brushing the cool metal. A voice startled him. "Can I help you?" Harold spun around to see a priest standing near the entrance, his kind eyes narrowing in concern. "Are you all right?" I was just—" Harold stammered. "I wanted to pray." The priest nodded slowly, though his expression remained cautious. "Of course. Take all the time you need." He stepped back into the shadows, his footsteps fading. Harold turned back to the altar, his heart racing. He didn't have much time. With one last glance over his shoulder, he grabbed the cross and slipped it into his coat pocket. The weight of it felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried a sense of guilt. Without looking back, Harold hurried out of the chapel, the doors creaking shut. When he returned home, the mirror was waiting. The figure's eyes glowed brightly as Harold held up the cross. "Well done," it said, its grin returning. "You have taken the first step, but this is only the beginning." Harold didn't reply. He placed the cross on the floor before the mirror and stepped back, his hands shaking. The figure's gaze lingered on him, as if savoring his discomfort. "Rest now, Harold," it said. "You will need your strength for what comes next." The mirror went dark, leaving Harold alone once more. He sank into a chair, his head in his hands. The cross felt like a lead weight in his pocket, its presence a constant reminder of what he had done. He wondered if his children would even recognize him after this, or if he would recognize himself. His reflection in the mirror seemed warped, distorted, as though the person staring back at him was someone else entirely. Harold awoke the next morning with a crushing sense of dread. The events of the previous day felt like a fever dream, but the heavy silver cross on his table was a stark reminder that it had all been real. The memory of the figure in the mirror, with its glowing eyes and jagged teeth, loomed large in his mind. He rubbed his temples, trying to shake off the feeling that he had crossed an invisible line, one he could never uncross. The mirror shimmered again as Harold sipped his coffee, the rippling glass drawing his reluctant gaze. The figure emerged, its elongated form somehow even more grotesque in the morning light. Its eyes glowed as it addressed him. "Harold," it said, the voice low and commanding. "Your first task has been completed. Now, we move on to the second." Harold set his coffee down, his hands trembling. "What is it this time?" he asked, his voice dry and cracked. The figure's grin widened. "The second task is one of sacrifice. You must destroy something that holds deep meaning to you, something tied to your past." The figure's voice took on a mocking tone. "Only by letting go of what binds you can you move forward." Harold's stomach churned. "What do you mean by destroy? Do you want me to burn something? Throw it away?" "Do not worry," the figure replied with a cruel smirk. "You will know what I mean when the time comes. Midnight is your deadline, Harold. I suggest you choose wisely." The mirror went dark, leaving Harold alone with his thoughts. Sacrifice. The word hung in the air like a noose around his neck. His mind raced as he tried to think of what the figure could want. Something from his past. Something meaningful. He wandered around the house, his eyes scanning the shelves and drawers, looking for an answer. His gaze landed on a small wooden box tucked away in the corner of his bookshelf. His heart sank as he opened it. Inside were keepsakes from his children, drawings they had made for him when they were young, birthday cards with their messy handwriting, and a lock of Emily's hair from her first haircut. He sank into a chair, clutching the box. These were the only tangible pieces of his children he had left, the only reminders of a time when they had been close, when they had been happy. The thought of destroying them made him feel physically ill. No, he whispered to himself, there has to be another way. But as the day wore on, he realized that he had no other option. The figure's words echoed in his mind. Destroy something tied to your past. He knew what it wanted, and the weight of the decision pressed down on him like a boulder. As the clock neared midnight, Harold found himself sitting in the living room, the wooden box on the floor in front of him. A lighter sat beside it, its metal surface cold and unforgiving. His hands trembled as he picked it up. "I can't do this," he muttered, his voice breaking. "I can't." The mirror flickered to life, the figure's glowing eyes watching him intently. "You must," it said, its voice devoid of sympathy. "The path forward is paved with sacrifice. Do it, or abandon your wish." Harold's throat tightened as tears streamed down his face. He picked up the first drawing, a crude crayon sketch of a house with stick figures labeled Daddy, Emily, and Patrick. His vision blurred as he held the lighter to the edge of the paper. The flames caught quickly, consuming the drawing in seconds. The heat stung his fingers, but he barely felt it through the numbness that had overtaken him. One by one, he fed the keepsakes to the fire. Each card, each drawing, each precious memory turned to ash. The lock of Emily's hair was the last to go. He hesitated, clutching it tightly in his hand. The mirror's glow intensified, the figure's voice sharp. "Do it, Harold." With a choked sob, he dropped the lock of hair into the fire. The flames hissed and sputtered as they consumed it, and Harold collapsed to the floor, his body racked with silent sobs. The mirror dimmed, the figure's voice softer now. "Well done," it said. "You have taken the second step, but the path is not yet complete. Rest, Harold. The final task awaits." Harold stared at the pile of ashes on the floor, his chest heaving with each ragged breath. He felt hollow, as if a part of his soul had been burned along with the keepsakes. He wondered if he would ever feel whole again, or if the pieces of himself that he had lost could never be recovered. The house was silent now, more so than it had ever been. The absence of the keepsakes felt like a gaping wound in the fabric of his life. Harold's hands trembled as he gathered the ashes into a small container, unsure of why he felt compelled to keep them. Perhaps it was guilt, or perhaps it was the last shred of humanity he could hold on to. As the hours ticked by, Harold sat in his chair, staring at the mirror. He didn't sleep. He didn't move. All he could do was wait. For what, he didn't know. The thought of the final task gnawed at him, filling him with a dread so profound it left him numb. When dawn came, Harold was still there, the lighter resting in his palm, the container of ashes on the table. The sun's rays illuminated the room, but they did nothing to chase away the shadows that lingered in his mind. The sun rose sluggishly the next morning, casting long shadows across Harold's living room. He had not moved from his chair all night, his mind heavy with the weight of what he had done. The box of ashes sat on the table, a haunting reminder of the sacrifices he had made. His fingers traced the edge of the container as he stared at the dormant mirror. He knew it was only a matter of time before the figure returned. As if summoned by his thoughts, the mirror began to shimmer. The glass rippled like water, and Harold braced himself as the familiar, twisted figure emerged once more. Its glowing eyes seemed sharper, more penetrating as it regarded him with its unsettling grin. "Harold," it began, its voice smooth yet laced with malice, "you have proven your resolve. But the final task awaits, and it will test you in ways you cannot yet imagine." Harold clenched his fists, his voice hoarse. "Just tell me what you want. Let's get this over with." The figure tilted its head, savoring his desperation. "Very well," it said. "Your final task is the ultimate test of loyalty and desire. You must confront the pain you cause to others. You must sever the final tie." Harold's brow furrowed. What does that mean? What pain? What tie? "You will understand soon enough," the figure replied cryptically. "Midnight is your deadline. Prepare yourself. The mirror darkened, leaving Harold alone again. The words echoed in Harold's mind. What pain had he caused? What tie was he meant to sever? He paced the room, his thoughts racing. The sacrifices he had made so far had hollowed him. What more could it demand? As the day wore on, Harold found himself drawn to the wooden box of ashes on the table. He sifted through the remnants of his children's keepsakes, his hands trembling as he tried to find an answer. But the ashes offered no clarity, only the bitter sting of loss. Midnight drew closer, and Harold's dread deepened. The mirror began to shimmer once more, and Harold sat frozen as the figure reappeared. Its presence filled the room with an oppressive weight, its glowing eyes boring into him. "Harold," it said, its voice colder than before, "it is time. Your final task is upon you." Harold swallowed hard. "What do you want me to do?" The figure's grin widened, its sharp teeth glinting. "You must confront the source of your guilt, the pain you inflicted on your family. You must sever the tie that binds you to your past." Harold's heart sank. "You want me to let them go?" The figure nodded slowly. "You have clung to them for too long. Your guilt and longing have chained you to suffering. Call their names and they will come. But understand, this will be the last time." The thought of seeing Emily and Patrick again, even for a moment, made Harold's chest ache. But saying goodbye forever? That was unbearable. The figure stepped back, its form fading into the shadows of the mirror. "Call them, Harold. Midnight approaches." Tears streamed down Harold's face as he knelt before the mirror. His hands shook as he lit the candles, their flickering flames casting eerie shadows. He clutched the photo of his children and whispered their names. Emily. Patrick. The air grew heavy, a chilling wind sweeping through to extinguish the candles. The mirror shimmered violently, and two figures began to emerge. Harold's breath hitched as he saw their faces. Emily and Patrick, just as he remembered them. "Dad?" Emily's voice was small, hesitant. "Emily. Patrick." Harold reached out, his hands trembling. "I'm so sorry, for everything. I never wanted us to end up like this." Patrick's gaze was steady. "We missed you, Dad. But it's time to say goodbye." Harold's heart shattered. "No. Please, don't go. I just wanted to fix things. I wanted us to be a family again." Emily stepped closer, her smile bittersweet. "We love you, Dad, but you have to let us go. It's the only way." Harold sobbed, his hands clutching at the empty air. "I can't. I don't know how to let you go." The mirror began to darken, the figures fading. Emily's voice was the last thing he heard. "You'll always have us in your heart. That's where we'll stay." The room fell silent, the mirror once again reflecting only Harold's anguished face. He collapsed to the floor, his body racked with sobs. The mirror shimmered faintly, the figure returning one last time. "You have completed the final task," it said, its voice devoid of malice. "The tie has been severed. You are free." Harold stared at the mirror, his eyes hollow. "Free? From what? I've lost everything." The figure tilted its head. "From yourself, Harold. From the prison you built out of guilt and regret. Now you can move forward." The mirror darkened, and the figure was gone. Harold sat alone in the silence, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. The sun rose once more, its light spilling into the room. Harold stared out the window, the ashes of his past scattered before him. For the first time in years, he felt the faintest glimmer of something he couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was peace, or perhaps it was simply emptiness. The days that followed were a blur for Harold. The house felt colder, emptier, as if the walls themselves mourned his sacrifices. The mirror sat dormant, reflecting his hollow face whenever he dared to look. Harold spent hours staring at the container of ashes on the table. He didn't know why he kept it. Perhaps it was the last part of himself he could hold on to. He hadn't slept in days. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard Emily's voice, saw Patrick's calm gaze, felt their presence fading into nothingness. The silence pressed in on him, suffocating. It was as if time itself had stopped moving. On the third night, Harold awoke to a sound he hadn't heard in years. Laughter. It was faint but unmistakable. Emily's laugh, bright and carefree. His breath hitched and his heart pounded as he bolted upright. For a moment he wondered if he was dreaming, but the sound came again, echoing faintly through the house. "Emily?" he called, his voice hoarse. "Patrick!" The laughter grew louder, leading him toward the living room. His hands trembled as he pushed the door open and his blood ran cold at the sight before him. The mirror, which had been dormant for days, shimmered once again, its surface rippling like disturbed water. But this time, it was not the grotesque figure staring back at him. It was Emily. She stood in the reflection, her small frame illuminated by a soft, otherworldly glow. Her eyes sparkled with mischief, just as they had when she was a child. "Daddy," she said, her voice sweet and familiar. "Why are you so sad?" Harold fell to his knees, his breath catching in his throat. "Emily, how are you here? I thought I let you go." Emily tilted her head, her smile playful. "You called me, didn't you? You don't have to be alone anymore." Harold's hands shook as he reached out toward the mirror, his fingers brushing the cold glass. "I missed you so much. I thought I'd never see you again." As his fingers lingered on the surface, Emily's image wavered and Patrick appeared beside her. His calm gaze pierced Harold's heart. "We're here now, Dad," Patrick said. "We can be together again, forever." Harold's heart swelled with hope, but something about their presence felt wrong. Their voices, though familiar, carried an eerie echo, hollow and distant. "I don't understand," Harold whispered. "The figure said I had to let you go. It said that was the only way." Patrick's smile widened unnaturally, his eyes glinting with something Harold couldn't place. "You don't have to listen to it. You've done enough. We can stay with you, Dad." Harold froze. The words hung in the air like poison. The idea of having them back, of never being alone again, was intoxicating. But deep down, he knew something wasn't right. "Are you really my children?" he asked, his voice trembling. Emily giggled, her laughter sharp and piercing. "Of course, silly. Who else would we be?" But Harold saw it now, the subtle flicker in their eyes, the faint distortion in their smiles. These were not his children. Whatever stood before him was something else, something wearing their faces. "Why are you here?" he demanded. "What do you want?" Patrick's expression darkened. "We're here because you called us. You couldn't let go, Harold. You refused to let us rest." Harold staggered backward, his heart pounding. "No. I let you go. I did what the figure asked. I made my sacrifices." Emily's voice turned cold. "You didn't let us go. You held on to the ashes. You called our names. You kept us here." Harold collapsed to the floor, the truth striking him like a hammer. He had clung to their memory, unable to release them. And now they had returned, not as the children he remembered, but as something else entirely. The mirror flickered and the grotesque figure reappeared, its glowing eyes glaring down at him. "You summoned them, Harold. Now you must banish them. If you do not, they will consume you." Harold shook his head violently. I can't send them away again." "You must," the figure insisted, "or you will remain their prisoner forever." Emily and Patrick's forms began to warp into grotesque mockeries of themselves. Their voices overlapped, distorted, growing louder and more demanding. "Stay with us, Dad. We'll never leave you." Harold clutched his head, tears streaming down his face. "I'm sorry," he choked out. "I'm so sorry." With trembling hands, he reached for the container of ashes on the table. The figure's voice echoed in his mind. Scatter them. Release the tie that binds them to this world. Harold opened the container, his hands shaking violently. The ashes felt cold and heavy, as if they carried the weight of his guilt. With a sob, he flung them into the air. The ashes swirled around him, caught in an unseen wind, before disappearing into the ether. The mirror went dark. The room fell silent. Harold collapsed onto the floor, his body trembling with exhaustion. The house was still. The oppressive weight that had lingered for so long finally lifted. But Harold felt no relief, only emptiness. He sat there for hours, staring at the darkened mirror. He whispered their names again, but no voices answered. No laughter returned. He was truly alone. The morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting pale streaks of light across Harold's face. He stirred in his chair, his body aching from hours spent motionless. The air in the room felt lighter, as though a heavy fog had lifted, but Harold's heart remained heavy. The ashes were gone, scattered into the void, and the mirror sat silent and unassuming. Harold's gaze lingered on it, wary of what might appear. For the first time in days, he forced himself to move. His limbs felt stiff, reluctant, but he shuffled into the kitchen. The sound of his footsteps broke the oppressive quiet. He poured himself coffee, though he barely tasted it. The bitterness matched the heaviness in his chest. Harold replayed the past week in his mind. The rituals, the mirror, the tasks, and the faces of his children. Those warped, distorted faces haunted him. He had wanted to bring them back, to hold them in his arms and hear their voices again. Instead, he had summoned something dark, something wrong. His eyes wandered to the mirror, its surface dull and lifeless. He couldn't bring himself to cover or move it. It felt like a sentinel watching over him, a reminder of the price he had paid. Harold wondered if it was truly over, if the figure would return, if it would demand more. The thought made his stomach churn. Hours passed, and Harold found himself pacing the house. He stopped at a dusty family photo on the bookshelf. Picking it up, he brushed his fingers over its edges. It was a picture of him, Emily, and Patrick at the beach, their faces bright with joy. Harold's smile in the photo felt like a cruel mockery. His chest tightened with grief as he traced their faces. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I tried." The photo felt heavy in his hands, carrying the weight of his failures. Harold set it back on the shelf. Every corner of the house was filled with echoes of the past. Laughter, arguments, moments of tenderness. He had thought bringing them back would heal him, but it had only deepened his wounds. As evening fell, Harold sat by the window, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky burned with hues of orange and red. For a moment, he felt peace. But it was fleeting. Shadows grew longer, creeping across the room. Harold's gaze drifted back to the mirror, his heart sinking at the faint ripple on its surface. "No," he muttered, his voice trembling. "Not again." The ripple grew, the glass shimmering like liquid. Harold's breath quickened. Bracing himself, he expected the grotesque figure to emerge. What appeared was far worse. It was his own reflection, twisted and broken, his eyes hollow, his face gaunt. The reflection stared at him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "Harold," it said, its voice a distorted echo. "Do you see what you've become?" Harold recoiled. "No, this isn't real. You're not real." The reflection's grin widened, its teeth sharp and unnatural. "You sought answers in the dark, and now you've brought it inside yourself. You can't escape it." Harold shook his head. "I let them go. I set them free." "Did you?" the reflection sneered. "Or did you hold on, even as you let them slip away? Your guilt, your regret, they bind you, Harold. They feed the darkness." Harold's chest tightened. "I don't want this. I never wanted this." "Then let it go," the reflection hissed. "Let it all go. The pain, the guilt. Only then will you be free." The words cut through Harold's thoughts. He closed his eyes, his hands trembling. Let it go. The phrase felt impossible, like severing a part of himself. But what choice did he have? The weight of the past had crushed him for so long. Perhaps it was time to release it. When Harold opened his eyes, the reflection was gone. The mirror was still, its surface smooth and unremarkable. Harold sat there, heart pounding, the silence pressing in once more. He felt lighter somehow, though he didn't understand why. Perhaps it was the act of facing himself. As night wore on, Harold returned to the living room, the photo of his children in his hands. He studied their faces, the joy and innocence captured in that single moment. A tear slid down his cheek, but he didn't wipe it away. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the grief fully, to let it wash over him. "I love you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I'll always love you." The words hung in the air, and Harold felt a sense of release, as if a weight had lifted. The room felt warmer, the shadows less oppressive. Harold placed the photo back on the shelf, his heart aching but steady. He turned to the mirror one last time. His reflection stared back at him. It was just him now. No figures, no distortions. Just Harold. He climbed the stairs to his bedroom, the creak of the floorboards the only sound in the house. As he lay in bed, the darkness felt less suffocating. For the first time in years, Harold allowed himself to hope, not for a reunion, but for peace. And as sleep claimed him, the house remained silent, the mirror undisturbed.